Thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab's free online webinar. You are currently participating in Governing in a Crisis. Questions are encouraged throughout the webinar. You may type them into the question box as they arise, and they'll be read by our moderator. Liz Vibber has over 30 years of experience providing strategic consultation to both the public and private sectors. She currently directs the marketing and management consultation services for the clients of B. Bergvall & Co., certified public accountants, and their affiliate, the Catalyst Center for Nonprofit Management. Such services include the development of business and strategic plans, board governance, and executive searches, as well as the facilitation of mergers and acquisitions within the nonprofit sector. She has earned a Master's of Science in Organizational Dynamics from the University of Pennsylvania and a Bachelor of Arts in Communications and Public Relations from Kutztown University. Liz has served on a number of board of directors and has held the position of board chair as well as chair of strategic planning and governance committees. I will now hand it over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to your questions and a lively discussion. So let's get going. Okay, so today we're talking about governing in times of crisis. So the learning objectives talk about the role of the board in a crisis, flow of communications during a crisis, and how planning for the future during this crisis can strengthen your organization. So the very first thing we're going to do is kick off with a poll. So how would you rate your board's performance prior to COVID? I'll give you a minute to answer here.
All right, Liz, it looks like we have 17% who are fully engaged with the organization, 75% who are partially engaged with the organization, and about 8% who are poorly engaged.
Okay. Okay. Well, hopefully this time will really activate us and activate your boards to really get moving. So let's talk a minute about what the responsibilities are for your board. So for that 8% whose boards are not engaged at all, and for those who are only partially engaged, spending a little bit of time here will really help you to remind your organizations and your board members exactly what their responsibilities are. So the board's the legal guardian of the organization, and they are responsible for the board's welfare. And this is done through the power to govern as well as the policies of the organization. So when we talk about governance, there's a concept known as governance as leadership. And it really is based on the premise that the stronger your governance is, the easier it is for that organization to function at a very high level. So we talk about governance in three different areas: fiduciary governance, which are the basics, nuts and bolts; strategic governance, which is really thinking forward and being planful for your organization. And then at the bottom of this triangle, we have our generative discussions. And these are the really high level discussions that very high functioning boards are able to engage in, which is not just how do we solve the problem that our mission presents, but how do we make our mission obsolete by really reaching and responding to societal issues. And very few organizations really ever get to that work, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So questions, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the challenges that you're currently having with your board that you hope to learn about today? A minute for you to type your responses in the chat box, and then I'll have a sense of where to put a little more emphasis. So are we getting any challenges?
Yes, we just got 2 in. So we've got someone stating that board retention has been a problem, and then understanding how crises hurt minorities more so than others, and then rural nonprofits. There's no financial commitment from the board members.
Okay. Okay. Let's see if we can't touch on some of these as part of our good governance. So let's start with legal obligations. And this, being really clear on these obligations and roles and responsibilities can help with retention, because as we're recruiting new board members, we're being very clear as to what the expectations are. So we talk about 3 duties: duty of loyalty, duty of care, and duty of obedience. So duty of loyalty, you want to make sure that your board members are placing the interests of the organization ahead of their own personal agendas and any of their own interests. You want to make sure that they're avoiding conflict of interest, and you want to have a conflict of interest policy that you're signing on an annual basis, reminding your board members of that. And you also want to make sure that your board members are prioritizing their commitment to the organization. Duty of care. You want to make sure that your board understands the work of the organization. And this is to that question we had earlier regarding understanding how COVID has affected minority and underrepresented communities more deeply than others. Making sure that you're educating your board and taking time in your board meetings to make sure that your board has all the information that they need. So board members should be asking really good questions during their board meetings and during the work of the organization. If they're not, you as executive directors and leaders should be prompting questions and putting time aside in your agenda to address some of these issues. And you want to make sure that the board is actively participating in committees and task groups. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. The final duty is a duty of obedience. And this really is twofold. One, we want to make sure that you're following the law, that you understand the societal law and you're not breaking the law, but also organizational law. And these are your bylaws. Your bylaws define your organizational law. So you want to make sure that your organization is abiding by them. And that's the board's responsibility to understand the bylaws, to know when they come into play, and to make sure that you're abiding by them. So now we have the 10 basic responsibilities. And again, this is all foundational groundwork for your organization. So we determine the mission, board members select the executive director, and number 3 and 4 are particularly of importance during a crisis. You want to make sure that board members are supporting and evaluating the executive director, and that you're ensuring effective planning. So if you have a strategic plan, if you're even talking about long-range planning, any of those things is the work of the board, and they should be doing that. So again, when we're recruiting, making sure our board understands the expectations will help you to retain them. Making sure that you're educating your board members about the work of the organization, ensures that they understand the work that they're doing and the importance of the work that they're doing. And that falls into monitoring and strengthening programs and services. 6 and 7, again, particularly important during a crisis, is to not only ensure adequate financial resources, but to protect them and to provide strong oversight for them. So hopefully you've all heard it, and you're all adhering to the philosophy that you should have 100% board giving. It's very important that board members understand whether they're giving $1 or whether they're giving $10,000 or $100,000 to your organization, that they are making a personal financial contribution so that you have 100% giving at the board level. And again, I know some of us have board members of all different economic means. And so we want to make sure that we create an opportunity for board members to make that donation, even if it is just $1, that they have become vested in that way. Other responsibilities are to build a competent board, legal and ethical integrity, and enhance the organization's public standing. You've heard me mention it a couple times already, so just to revisit board expectations. Every board member should know, they should understand whether they have board terms, whether they have limits to those terms. Your bylaws will outline that and define that. So make sure that everyone's understanding that. Make sure your board members understand the attendance policy. If you meet monthly and you hold 11 or 12 meetings per year, you want to make sure that board members know that they are expected to be attending 8 or 9 of those board meetings. What happens if they can't attend? What is the protocol for absence? Some bylaws state that after 3 unexcused absences, board members are separated from the board. And so that allows you to free up a space for someone who is engaged. Now, of course, you can make exceptions if there are certain circumstances why a board member might need to take a leave of absence. Time commitment. You want to be very clear on what the time commitment is for a board member. Is it just 1 hour a month or 2 hours a month? Or more realistically, when we factor in committee work and task group work and maybe attending events or fundraisers, it might be 5 to 10 hours per month for a board member's commitment to the organization. Your officers might be 10 to 15 hours per month. So you want to be very, very clear on that, and that will assist in retention. You want to make sure that the board understands their work commitment. They serve on committees, they serve on task groups, etc. Again, that financial commitment. Participation in fundraising activities, organizational activities, and enhancing public standing. So at the beginning of every year, if you have a board expectation document, a board contract, annual expectation, whatever you call it, you should have a document that highlights all of these points and that board members sign so that they know exactly what the expectation is for them during the course of their term. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about best practices. And again, this falls under that governance as leadership. So the stronger our best practices and our policies and our procedures, the easier it is in many ways for us to do the work of the organization, especially during a crisis. And just so you know, sources that I use for this presentation include BoardSource. I am located in Pennsylvania, so the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, or PANO, is our standards for excellence provider. Many states have them. And then the National Council of Nonprofits is another resource. So that brings us to our next poll question. And that poll question is, does your organization have the following plans or policies? If you can answer yes or no to these different policies. That would be a communications policy, disaster crisis policy, financial policy, gift acceptance policy, and a succession plan.
Okay, it looks like 71% of our participants have communications plans, disaster crisis policies, and gift acceptance policies. 86% of them have financial policies, and 36% of them have succession plans.
Okay, wonderful. Good, good. I'm glad to see that those numbers are so high, especially for your financial plan, your financial policy. Because as we know during COVID, understanding those finances and the hits that your finances have taken have really been critical. So having a policy to be able to follow becomes critical during these times. Same with the gift acceptance policy. You know, the other crisis that's facing our country right now is the Black Lives Matter movement. and understanding what is a gift acceptance policy. There might be organizations who have values that your nonprofit has decided we will not accept donations or support or sponsorships from certain types of organizations. So your gift acceptance policy, when you have that spelled out and in place, it allows you as an organization, especially during a crisis, to very quickly decide whether or not you're going to accept that donation. Is it in line with our policy and our values? Yes, then we'll accept it. No, I'm sorry, donor. That's not part of our policy. It's not in line with our values, and you're very clear on that, and you can state very clearly. So having policies in place in all these different areas really helps provide clarity when you're making decisions in a very tense or heated situation. So the flow of communications in your organization. And this is really when a crisis hits. And for many of us, this is the first crisis that we have encountered. For others, there have been a number of instances where we've had to very quickly engage communication. So I'm curious, does communication start and move only with your executive director? Is there someone else on staff that handles that? Or is it just whoever happens to answer the phone at that particular time? So if you could take a minute and just provide me with a little bit of feedback about the flow of communications.
While we're waiting for those answers to come in, we had someone asking about if they have none of the above of all of the last poll that you ran. They didn't have any of those plans and policies. Do you want to talk a bit about that while those questions come in?
Sure. You know, the wonderful thing about policies is that there are many, many samples and examples out there. And earlier in the presentation, I referenced PANA, which is the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations. They have samples and templates for all these policies. Asking your colleagues and other organizations if they have a gift acceptance policy that you can use and review. You'll want to provide your governance committee with those policy samples to look at and to vet through for your organization, and then bring them to the full board for a vote. If you want to reach out to me after this webinar, I'm happy to share some resources with you and direct you to some sample policies.
Thank you, Liz. And we do have a couple answers to your question. One person says CEO, then board chair. Another says board to executive director to staff, and then to volunteers and clients. And then another person says we have an acceptance policy, but don't write it down. We take decisions like a magic act from our heart.
So on that last comment about the writing the gift acceptance policy down, I highly recommend that you do have some sort of guidelines or boundaries for that moving forward, so that future leaders and future board members understand where you've been, and you're not taking up precious board meeting time hashing out and discussing whether or not you're going to accept a gift or not. So let's talk a little bit about in a crisis and communicating. And it sounds like there are some different flows of communication. The one thing that underlines all of this is that communicating what you need with your board will help you do the best for your organization. They need and deserve transparency and clarity. So we recommend having a flow of communications that looks something like this. As soon as we know that there's a crisis on the horizon or things are happening, the chair of the board or president of your board, if you use that model, and the executive director / CEO should begin communicating immediately with one another and really trying to get a handle on what this looks like for your organization. And then broaden that discussion out to the executive committee so that the executive committee understands a bit more about what the situation is and what potential implications there may be. And once your executive committee has a handle on this, then you can open up and share what's happening with the full board. You may, during COVID, you may have convened an emergency board meeting, and that's perfectly acceptable to do. In fact, it's highly advisable to do, especially if you don't meet monthly, because you want to make sure that everyone's informed, because we all know that in the absence of regular and accurate communications, it's human nature to begin to fill in the blanks and make things up. So we want to make sure that our board is completely informed. And then that allows us to take the next step, which is a screen circle, which is a crisis team. And I'll talk a little bit about what that crisis team may look like. So falling back on best practices and governance, you should have a committee structure. And committees are standing and necessary. And your bylaws might dictate which committees you have. And your bylaws should also dictate that committees should be formed as necessary by the board. Committees should have a job description. They meet regularly and they do ongoing work. And in a crisis, those committees may pivot the work that they're doing to meet the need. So your finance committee may have pivoted its work. Your development or fundraising committee may have pivoted. Your communications committee may have pivoted. Your outreach may have pivoted. So all of those committees need to understand what their role in this crisis is going to be. By the same token, you have task groups, or you should have task groups as part of your governance structure. Task groups are really formed as needed. They have a very defined purpose. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they have a set time frame. So you might form a task group to plan a special event. And when that event is done, the group dismantles. In a crisis, you may formulate a specific task group to deal with a particular issue. Early on, we had the question about informing and educating the board about how COVID has affected certain underrepresented communities more than others. Well, you might put together a task group to really dig in and research that and work with staff to gain all of the knowledge that your board needs on this specific topic so that they can have an understanding in their decision making. You might form a task group for any number of other situations that are occurring in your organization. So let's just take a minute and see. That's a lot of ground that we've covered. That's about a 3-hour presentation that we've covered in the last 23 minutes. So any questions that we have right now?
We do have something that you can talk about while some of our attendees give us their questions, but when you're talking about challenges of the board, they're saying that validating relevancy of your mission and purpose in times of crisis and being willing to pivot when necessary. Do you have any notes on that?
I do, and we're actually in the second part, when we start talking about planning, we will address that in a little bit more detail. But now more than ever, your organization should be really thinking about mission and mission impact, and where do we fit in, and how does our mission address the needs of our constituents, especially in this time. One of our responsibilities is defining our mission, and it's also managing it and modifying it when necessary. But again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Perfect. And just one more question before you move on. They ask, how often do you suggest committees meet?
So it really depends on the amount of work that they need to do. If you are an organization that has a large and well-funded staff, then the committee work might be more at the governing level, and committees may not need to meet as frequently. If you're more of a grassroots organization where you depend on your board members to really provide support to the executive director and the team, then they're going to be meeting more frequently. If you're an all volunteer organization, then those committees are going to be meeting very much on a regular basis. So it really depends on the amount of work that your board is doing at the committee level to support the organization. So I just want to take a second here to go in a little bit deeper on an example of how a committee has been activated during the COVID crisis. And so here I'm using an example from the Finance Committee. So the Finance Committee, their regular work might be to assist the Executive Director in forming the budget, to monitor the financials of the organization on a regular basis, and then report back to the board and make financial decisions. But during this crisis, it became evident that many organizations needed to really think very strategically about their finances. And so the work of the Finance Committee in this example has really pivoted to looking very short term at cash. So what were we projecting for May? What were we projecting for June and July? And thinking about what that revenue might be, what our expenses might be. And again, in this example, they looked at revenue and thought, okay, if we continue to get 100% of the revenue that we had originally planned for pre-COVID, it looks like this. But what if we only get 80%? What if we only get 50%? What if our funding sources or our donations dry up? Many organizations had to cancel special events, and that led to a significant decrease in revenue that was unexpected and unplanned for. So in this example, the Finance Committee really gathered, they circled the wagons, they dug into the numbers, they worked with the executive and the CFO and really looked at different scenarios. And what resulted, and this could really apply to any committee, the committee really worked with the executive and the staff to think about, okay, what is the best case scenario in this crisis? What's the worst case? And what is the most likely? And by having done this work, this deeper dive, they're better prepared to answer some of these questions. So we want to talk about what that worst case scenario might be, and we want to plan for it so that we're not caught cold. And then we want to take action, and we want to monitor as we go. So open-ended poll questions. If you all feel comfortable, if some of you could share some examples of how your board activated during this crisis. So I can tell you for my personal board, we started meeting every 2 weeks. We had call-ins with the executive director and our COO to understand what was happening on almost a week-by-week basis so that we knew what decisions to make. We looked at finances during that time, and we made a very significant decision to sell a property. It was something that we weren't planning on doing for a long period of time, maybe next year, but we ramped those plans forward. But what are some examples from other organizations?
We have a couple answers here. One person states that they had flexibility in meetings via Zoom and abbreviated their agendas, but had more frequent meetings. And another individual said that they activated very quickly and tried to meet often starting in mid-March. We have one person admitting that they didn't/haven't, which is why they're here. And
well, I'm glad you're here, and that sounds like some really great strategies, because the more information we have, the more knowledge we have, the better able we are to act. And meeting more frequently, even for shorter periods of time, really allows us to digest information in between. One thing that's really important, especially where we are now, is that you as leaders, executive directors, CEOs have take a minute to really pause and understand where you've been and how difficult it's been. We were all balancing our health, our families. For many of us, the need is greater, the resources are fewer, and the time ahead of us looks much longer. So when we go back to those responsibilities, board members, we talk about supporting the executive director. This is a prime time. I truly hope that all of your boards have asked you how you're doing, what you need, how they can help. This is a great time for board members to throw a pizza party, for example, for staff, or provide some act of kindness, even if it's just a thank you note. We wrote thank you notes to our staff. We work in a healthcare environment, and we had frontline staff who were suiting up in PPE and still serving. So we made sure we wrote thank you notes to them. So one other thing I want to mention here, this 30, 60, 90-day crack. One of the CEOs that I meet with on a regular basis is former military. And his job when he was active military was to help units move and set up in new locations. And what he learned is usually within that first 30-day period, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of activity around the move. And then 60 days in, things start to settle in, and people start to realize, they start to come down off that high, if you will, and the cracks begin to show. And 90 and 100 days in, a lot of organizations are really starting to see some pretty big cracks in their staff, in themselves, in their organizational structure. So make sure that you give time and space to your organization to address these cracks. We have a couple of clients who have furloughed staff at this point. They have used the month of July while there's still a little bit of extra unemployment benefit from the federal government to furlough staff and give them a chance to recharge their batteries. And that became part of the planning and the financial planning that they did early on back in March and April and May. So as we move forward, as we look at crisis, recovery, and change. So we've dealt with the crisis, with the COVID crisis, for those of you who are on the front lines of Black Lives Matter. And now we're really moving toward recovery, and most importantly for many of us, we're moving toward change. And so what does that look like? So I have a full question for you regarding your strategic plan. So do you have a strategic plan? Do you use it? Or is that just wishful thinking for some of you? So if you could take a minute to answer that question.
Okay, it looks like we've got 67% saying that they regularly review and update theirs. 8% say that they have one, but they rarely look at it. 17% say they do not have a strategic plan, and 8% asking, what is a strategic plan?
Okay, well, to the 67%, congratulations. I'm happy to hear that you have it, that you regularly look at it, and that it has served as a guide. And now it's time to update it. For those of you who have it, those of you who don't have it, or have never had one, this is an excellent time to begin to engage in some strategic thinking for your organization, even if it doesn't result in a full plan, to really at least begin to think about things. There's a concept from an article, and the link to the article is in these slides, about the time that we're in now. Are we in a blizzard? Are we in the winter season? Or are we in an ice age? And your strategic plan, in some cases, will be able to easily respond to each of these scenarios, or it may need to be adapted for each of these scenarios. So if we're in a blizzard, we know that it's a pretty short-term event, that it's going to pass fairly quickly. From a governing and a crisis standpoint, the board will likely have a very small or even no role in this. This will all happen within the operations with the executive and her team. So you'll need to be nimble, responsive, but know that it's just a temporary situation, right? Because blizzards pass. This is a strategic work of the board. But what if it's going on longer? What if we're talking about a full winter? If we're talking about longer term than just a week or 2 weeks, then the board really needs to become more actively engaged. And they're going to do this via their committee and task group work. And they're going to need to be more planful and think longer term. And some of the responses that were activated early on might become permanent. So these things begin to weave into your strategic plan. I mentioned earlier that I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from Bucks County, which is not too far outside of New York City. And when COVID first started, we were one of the first school districts to close the schools because we had students who had attended a funeral that we knew people were diagnosed with COVID were also at that funeral. And so schools began to very quickly make decisions. And so what began as a blizzard planning to close for just 2 weeks became clear that it was winter planning, that they were closing for the rest of the school year. And now we're sitting at a point thinking of, okay, are we planning for the ice age? What does the long term look like? What does next year look like? Do we go back to school? And if so, what does it look like? So this is where the board's role really begins to dig in, because the committee work and the task group work will become very it'll become important, and it'll start to go deeper. So this is where we do that mission check that we talked about early on. We want to make sure that we're securing the proper resources for the long term. Maybe we need to reallocate resources. We begin to think more deliberately about strategic collaborations. We begin to think about mergers. And unfortunately, we're starting to see some clients thinking about dissolution and thinking, okay, there's no way, we've run the numbers, we've looked long range, we know we're not going to be able to survive past 4-6 months. And so some are making the very difficult decision that if they dissolve now, they still have assets, they can transfer those assets to another nonprofit organization that's in a better position to continue serving. And those are really, really difficult generative, fiduciary, and strategic conversations that the board should be having right now. This is when your board becomes both reactive and proactive. They begin thinking long-term strategic, and this is not just the new normal, but this is the now normal. We're really beginning to adapt to changes coming very quickly. And we begin to want to look at both opportunities and threats. For a strategic plan, looking at those opportunities will really drive you forward. 3 things nonprofits should prioritize in the wake of COVID-19, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. Social impact. What is the social impact of your organization? Does it need to be revisited? Does it need to be redefined? How do you fit into the larger fabric of the community? What is the economic viability of your organization? Are you good at securing resources and revenue? Will you be able to remain strong? Or are you perhaps securing resources that could be better utilized in other areas? That's a really difficult question for a board to wrestle with. And then capacity. What is our capacity? What can we do? Have we had to lay off or furlough staff? Is this a time to bring on new staff? What does capacity look like in terms of technology for our organization? And again, what does it look like now and what does it look like in the long term? So this is a time when planning, we're really beginning to engage in some of this strategic thinking. We're going to want to set time aside in our board meetings to revisit our mission, our vision, and our values. And this is not just for us as an organization, but maybe this is for our vendors. What are the values of the other businesses and organizations that we regularly interact with? That can become very, very important for many organizations. What's our social impact? What are operational and programming priorities? We might need to scale way back and only hone in on one or two areas to focus on basic needs. And again, understanding and communicating what that looks like, being able to work through the problems, will be able to make us better informed as we make decisions moving forward. Other strategic thinking questions that we want to be engaging in right now is taking a chance to do a pulse check. What's working? What's not working right now? What do we need to address? For many organizations, Zoom technology or some other virtual platform, telehealth, they have really changed the way organizations provide services. We have a local domestic violence organization that was able to move some of their support group meetings virtually, which enabled clients to be able to attend when they might not have been able to attend previously. And it really opened up and engaged some of those therapy sessions in a way that they hadn't done pre-COVID, because it was something that they had talked about, but the crisis really forced them to do it. So now, rather than thinking about going back to what was before, they're thinking about, okay, how do we use this technology as an opportunity to serve more clients in a different way, a larger geography, perhaps different time, different times for therapy sessions, et cetera, et cetera. We also want to take a look at what's working in the community as a whole. So who's successfully meeting the challenges of our community, and how do we come alongside them? How do we support them? How do we perhaps shift our focus to be more of a resource to them? And do we amplify and form new collaborations during this time? So all of these things, all of these strategic questions, thinking questions, you should be asking for your board during this time. And then to close with, generative thinking. Do we have the luxury of really stopping and challenging ourselves and our board to think about, how do we change the system? How do we address underlying issues? How do we not just plan our way out of this crisis, but how do we prevent this crisis from ever occurring again? And these become very deep and generative questions, and we may ask them to our board in our own boardroom, but we might begin to partner and make the conversation broader. We're starting to see some foundations in our area really support the work of organizations in the community to answer some of these generative questions. So at this point, open up to any questions that you may have. And I would love to know from you, as a result of this webinar, what is something that you've learned and what is one action step that you will commit to taking?
Liz, it looks like we are getting towards the end of our time. If you want to give your closing remarks, we can try to get some of those answers in after you finish giving your contact information and all that.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for your time and attention during this session. We covered a lot of ground. We did it in 45 minutes, what normally would take hours and hours of time to really dig into. So if you have questions, if you're looking for resources, on the screen is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. And if I can be of assistance to you, I would be happy to do so.
Okay, and back to some of those answers. We have someone saying that they began to start the process of filling in the gaps in overall policy and plans during COVID, and your remarks and ideas emphasize that they're going in the right direction, so they wanted to thank you for that.
Fabulous.
And then another person says, as a person not that close to the board in my nonprofit, it was great getting to learn how complex the communication is, especially during a crisis. And one more person says that they're writing their acceptance policy and generative thinking.
Perfect. Perfect. Good.
Okay, and now I guess, thank you, Liz. This workshop has come to a close. All of these materials and recordings for this webinar will be available on our website. And if you have any further questions, we will absolutely put you in touch with Liz. Thank you so much for participating in Governing in a Crisis. And again, thank you, Liz, so much for educating our community.
Absolutely. It's my privilege to do so. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.